She was only 10 years old when she committed her first killing. It's a chilling reality, isn't it? It forces us to ask some seriously unsettling questions about human behavior. Today, we're looking at the 1968 case of Mary Bell, a case that absolutely shook the world and honestly continues to challenge our understanding of juvenile forensic psychology today. After her arrest, psychiatrists used language that painted a picture of a quote-unquote psychopathic personality. But as you'll see in this explainer, just throwing around a term like that doesn't actually settle the question of what was psychologically happening.
So this brings us to a central question. When a child commits an extraordinarily serious offense, how do we actually distinguish a persistent behavioral disorder from the intense effects of extreme trauma? Or, more complicated still, can both explanations be true at the exact same time? We're going to unpack exactly how clinical evaluators separate a persistent behavioral disorder from trauma adaptations and from the developmental limitations of childhood itself.
Now, before we really begin our analysis, we must pause for a vital disclaimer. This explainer is strictly educational. We aren't here to glamorize offenders or try to diagnose people from media accounts. Most importantly, we must respectfully acknowledge Martin Brown and Brian Howe, two young children whose lives and families were permanently devastated. Their victimization should never ever become secondary to our clinical fascination with the person who killed them.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our clinical roadmap for unpacking this complex profile. 1. The 1968 diagnosis. 2. What is conduct disorder? 3. The trauma pathway. 4. Profiling Mary Bell. 5. The bad seed myth. And finally, 6. Diagnosis and responsibility. Section 1. The 1968 diagnosis. In 1968 in Newcastle upon Tyne, England, 4-year-old Martin Brown and 3-year-old Brian Howe were killed. 10-year-old Mary Bell was convicted of their manslaughters on the grounds of diminished responsibility. When psychiatrists evaluated Mary at the time, they reached for the term psychopathic personality disorder. A defense expert described it as an abnormal or delayed development of the mind that substantially impaired her responsibility. But we really have to tread carefully here. The language used back in 1968 just does not map neatly onto our contemporary diagnostic manuals. So the crucial point is this. Historically, psychopathic personality was applied much more broadly than our highly specific modern concept of psychopathy. We literally cannot just take an old diagnostic label and slap it onto a modern framework. Mary was a child, meaning an adult diagnosis like antisocial personality disorder wouldn't even be appropriate today. Section 2. What is conduct disorder? If we can't use that 1968 label, what clinical tools do we actually use today to evaluate a case like this?
Well, conduct disorder is diagnosed when a child or adolescent demonstrates a repetitive, persistent pattern of violating other people's rights or major age-appropriate rules. These symptoms fall into 4 broad buckets: aggression toward people or animals, destruction of property, deceitfulness or theft, and serious violations of rules. The key word here, pattern. Clinicians are looking for a true pattern. They aren't just looking at mere disobedience, normal teenage rebellion, or even one isolated shocking offense. They examine how often it happens, how long it's persisted, and whether the child understood the consequences. Now, we have to bust a very common myth right here. People often inaccurately describe conduct disorder as childhood antisocial personality disorder or childhood psychopathy. That is incredibly misleading. Development is active, right? Environmental circumstances change. An apparent emotional coldness during a police interview might look like a psychopathic lack of empathy, but it can actually arise from fear, dissociation, or learned emotional suppression. A child's temporary emotional presentation is never enough to establish a permanent personality pattern. Section 3. The trauma pathway. We really need to look at another powerful force in a child's psychological development, one that can sometimes completely mimic other clinical disorders. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive complication evaluators actually face. See, traumatized children don't all react by becoming anxious and withdrawn. Some become aggressive, distrustful, and defiant. A child exposed to chronic victimization might learn that relationships are inherently dangerous, so they use aggression for temporary protection. Outwardly, that looks absolutely identical to a child with a behavioral disorder who uses aggression deliberately to dominate others. It's one behavior, but 2 entirely different psychological pathways. Section 4. Profiling Mary Bell. Let's bring all these modern clinical definitions back to Mary Bell's specific, documented historical profile. When we look at the historical record, Bell's behavior undeniably contained features of conduct disorder, repeated aggression toward younger children, as well as violence and deception before the homicides even occurred. But alongside this, later accounts describe an incredibly unstable and abusive childhood. There were allegations of severe physical and sexual victimization, disrupted caregiving, and a mother-daughter relationship characterized by intense danger and exploitation. There is a vital truth here that we really have to let sink in. One diagnosis does not cancel the other. The most defensible clinical conclusion is not that her trauma somehow erases the evidence of a conduct disorder, nor that her behavioral symptoms disprove her trauma. Both may have been completely relevant. A child can carry a substantial trauma history and simultaneously meet the criteria for a severe behavioral disorder. Section 5. The bad seed myth. When society is faced with frightening behavior from a child, we so often fall back on a very specific, emotionally powerful narrative. We fall back on the idea of the bad seed, this idea of a child born naturally and permanently dangerous. But in reality, childhood development is a continuous, wildly complex interaction of temperament, brain development, attachment, trauma, and social environment. A child's personality is simply not a completed adult structure. Recognizing these influences doesn't minimize the terrible harm done, but it definitely demands humility when we try predicting permanent dangerousness. In fact, Bell was reportedly released at age 23 and has not been publicly connected to any subsequent serious violence. Section 6. Diagnosis and responsibility. Let's see how this builds our understanding of forensic psychology in the real world. We absolutely have to separate clinical vulnerability from legal guilt. The clinician asks a psychological question: what developmental and trauma factors influenced this behavior? But the court asks a very different question: are the legal requirements for an offense satisfied? Trauma might help us understand a child's threat perception, sure, but it does not automatically make every resulting violent action involuntary or legally establish diminished responsibility. This right here is the golden rule of forensic psychology. Explanation is not exoneration. Understanding the deep psychological drivers, the abuse or the behavioral disorders that led a child to commit a horrific act, does not erase the devastating harm done to the victims and their families. We can clinically understand the why without legally or morally excusing the what. So, what should you actually take away from this explainer? First, a diagnosis of conduct disorder requires a persistent pattern. The shock value of a single offense just isn't enough. Second, trauma and behavioral disorders are not mutually exclusive. They very often co-occur. And third, children are not completed versions of the adults they might become. Evaluators must look at the whole combination of development and circumstance to figure out what interventions might actually reduce future risk. Mary Bell's reported behaviors clearly developed over time. But what happens when a young person's violence isn't a long pattern, but is instead described as sudden, impulsive, and grossly disproportionate to the situation? In our next explainer, we're going to dive into the case of Eric Smith and try to figure out, was it intermittent explosive disorder, conduct disorder, or something else entirely? You definitely won't want to miss it.